Aidan Fox had never been a man to chase comfort. For most of his adult life, he had gravitated toward the edges of things, geographic borders, ideological fault lines, professional roles that kept him observing more than participating. Perhaps it was a symptom of the work he had done in his 20s and 30s, mapping soil movement and topographic drift for state contracts in regions where no one else wanted to live, or perhaps it was something deeper. Embedded in the way he had grown up, raised by a father who served as a wildland firefighter and a mother who taught environmental ethics at a community college, both of them instilling in him a quiet reverence for the land and a preference for solitude over noise. Whatever the origin, it was no surprise to anyone who knew him when, after selling off the last of his consulting equipment and closing the books on his final contract, Aidan used the money to purchase 78 acres of rugged, dry land just east of Yuma, Arizona, at the tail end of a road that didn't officially exist on any map newer than 1994. He had chosen the land for reasons that were practical, spiritual, and personal. The old ranch site had long since been abandoned. There were no power lines, no irrigation, no neighbors within shouting distance, and just enough topography to give him room to build without flattening the earth. The deed had passed through a dozen hands since the late 80s, but the boundaries were clear, the land unincorporated, and no recorded easements existed. Aidan had spent 2 months doing title research before closing the deal. He wasn't the kind of man to rely on hearsay. He called county offices, dug up old plat maps, double-checked zoning overlays, and personally walked the entire perimeter with a handheld GPS, marking fence posts and worn cattle paths and erosion scars. When he finally signed the documents and wired the payment, he felt no need to celebrate. He didn't tell anyone except his sister, who lived 3 states away. This land wasn't meant to be a conversation piece. It was supposed to be a clean page, a project without deadlines, a place to rebuild something permanent with his own hands. The first few weeks passed in a quiet rhythm of labor and repair. Aidan hauled out truckloads of trash left by years of neglect, broken pallets, rusted fencing, empty ammunition boxes, and inexplicably, dozens of glass bottles buried in the soil. He brought in a prefabricated trailer, fitted it with solar panels and a rainwater collection system, then spent his days clearing invasive mesquite and leveling out the path that would eventually become a proper drive. He had a small diesel generator for emergencies, a filtered water tank, a satellite connection for the few digital tools he still used, and a shortwave radio that only ever seemed to pick up truckers and static. In the mornings, he would make black coffee and sit in a fold-out chair, watching the sun crawl up the low hills to the east and turn the dry world gold. He kept a notebook by his side and filled it with diagrams, sketches, plans. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't aesthetic. It was methodical, deliberate, and deeply satisfying. The land didn't welcome him, but it didn't reject him either. It simply tolerated him, the way it would tolerate anything that didn't try to dominate it. There were wild hares, hawks, snakes, and the occasional sighting of a coyote, but no threat, no drama, just the quiet logic of the desert. Aidan worked, sweat, planned, adjusted. His hands hardened again. His back grew sore. He felt alive in a way that people who live in cities have long forgotten how to feel. He slept with the windows open, with nothing but a screen to keep the air moving and the insects out. At night, the stars made their own kind of noise. That balance lasted for exactly 35 days. On the 36th morning, Aidan returned from a supply-run non-perishable food, bolts, wiring, and fresh diesel to find a woman standing at the bottom of his drive, just past the temporary cattle gate he had installed with PVC and concrete anchors. She wasn't young, nor was she old, maybe early 60s, with a tight bun, a pressed linen shirt, and a clipboard that hung from her arm like an extension of her personality. She wore a thin windbreaker despite the heat, and her expression was tight, like she had bitten into something sour and now couldn't figure out whether to spit it out or swallow it. Her SUV was parked at a slight angle near the edge of the road, wheels turned as if ready to make a quick exit. She didn't wave. Aidan stopped the truck, put it in park, and stepped out calmly, keeping his posture relaxed but alert. He nodded once. "Morning." The woman didn't smile. "Are you the one staying out here?" "I own the property," he said plainly, without elaboration. She pursed her lips. "I live 2 miles west. This road's seen nothing but dust and old ranchers for 20 years. Now suddenly there's noise, lights, equipment. My dogs can hear generators at night. They bark." Aiden didn't answer right away. He looked past her, at the open stretch of land behind her car, where dust devils spun quietly between brittle shrubs. Then he looked back at her. "Not sure what you're implying, Ma. I'm not running a shop. I'm building." "Are you American?" The question caught him off guard, not because it shocked him, but because of how casually she delivered it, like she was asking about the weather. "I am," he said evenly. "Because people out here don't just show up and start doing things," she said, stepping closer to his gate. "We've got standards. This is a tight-knit area. I'm not asking for anyone's help or approval. I bought the land fair and legal." She clicked her tongue. "We'll see about that." Then she turned and walked back to her car without another word. That evening, a cruiser showed up. Not fast, not loud, just a steady approach down the unpaved road until the vehicle eased to a stop 50 feet from his trailer. 2 officers stepped out, one younger, one older, light but distant. Asked about his presence, his plans, his documentation. Aiden provided everything. Title deed, permits for off-grid development, copy of the survey. They said they'd received a call from a concerned resident claiming he had crossed a boundary. They didn't specify what kind of boundary. When he asked for clarification, the older officer only said, "It's probably nothing. Just people feeling uncertain." They left after 15 minutes. No citations, no warnings. But it wasn't nothing. 2 days later, Aiden found a laminated sign zip tied to a metal post driven into the dirt 30 yards from his boundary. The sign read, "Protected Zone, Federal Easement, Trespassing Subject to Investigation." It had no seal, no barcode, no legal reference. It wasn't even weathered. It looked like it had been made on a home printer and laminated at the local office supply store. Still, it was there, planted not in the woman's yard, but in his. That was when the pattern began, not of confrontation, but of quiet assertion. The suggestion, repeated and reinforced in subtle ways, that Aiden didn't belong here not because he had done something wrong, but because he didn't fit the profile of someone who should be trusted with this much land, this much freedom, or this much distance from oversight. It was the kind of hostility that never raises its voice but tightens the screws slowly, one thread at a time. The kind that doesn't need to prove you're guilty, only make enough people feel uncomfortable with your existence that eventually someone else does the job for them. Aiden understood the terrain, not just the literal terrain of dry clay and scattered shale, but the social one. He knew what it meant when a stranger tried to erase you quietly. And he knew that silence his old friend was no longer protection. Not here. Not now. He started documenting everything. Not out of paranoia, out of necessity. Because the war that had just begun wouldn't be fought with fists or weapons. It would be fought with narrative, with implication, and with every crooked tool a system could use to take a man's land without ever touching him. And so, the battle line was drawn. The following week unfolded like a mirage, one of those stretches of time where the air feels too still and everything around you seems staged to appear normal, while something fundamental just beneath the surface shifts out of place. Aiden kept to his routine. He cleared brush, marked irrigation contours, worked on insulating the trailer's west-facing wall. His boots became dustier, his hands tougher, and yet he couldn't shake the sense that a presence had begun to gather along the edge of his world, not physical at first, but psychological, like the mental version of watching smoke curl from behind a hill you know is dry as bone. It began with the absence of something rather than its arrival. No more signs of wildlife, no early morning bird chatter, no fresh prints in the dirt near the wash where deer sometimes passed through. Then came the tire tracks, deep and fresh, carved into the eastern edge of the property where there was no path, no reason for anyone to be. They weren't his. He hadn't driven that route, and he knew the curve of his own treads better than he knew the veins on the back of his hand. He bent over them one morning, a wrench in one hand and a water bottle in the other, just staring, calculating. They were too wide for an ATV and too shallow for a heavy truck. Someone had been creeping in, probably at night, driving just far enough to inspect, then pulling back before sunrise. A few days later, he found the orange marker flags. Small plastic triangles stuck into the ground in a tight row, 15 feet apart, tracing an invisible line across his western boundary. At first he assumed they were remnants of a previous survey, something missed when the land changed hands. But when he checked the photos he had taken before starting the clearing work, they weren't there. Someone had placed them recently. He yanked them up and tossed them in a box. He didn't tell anyone, not yet. But that evening he left his field equipment running longer than usual, the soft whir of the motion cameras powered by solar backup now tracking every frame from dusk until dawn. Not because he expected confrontation, but because he was beginning to understand the game being played against him had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with layered plausibility, plausible concern, plausible inquiry, plausible authority. The call came the next morning, not from a government line, but from a block number. He let it go to voicemail. The message, left in a clipped, almost sterile tone, informed him that a community advocate had raised concerns about improper use of land that bordered a conservation corridor, and that it would be advisable to cease development until parcel compliance could be verified through appropriate administrative review. No names, no agency, no callback number. Just the suggestion that he was in the wrong and the implication that someone had both the knowledge and the initiative to act as if they had power. Aiden didn't call back. He saved the voicemail, time-stamped it, transcribed it, and added it to a folder he was building just in case. That night, he heard the engine again. It was subtle at first, just a low hum far down the road, followed by silence. Then the crunch of slow tires over gravel, the mechanical whisper of gears shifting as weight adjusted. He shut off his light, stepped outside barefoot onto the cool ground, and watched. A pair of headlights sat still behind the far stand of Ocotillo, low and shielded from full view. No one stepped out, no movement. After a few minutes, the lights turned off. Total blackness followed. No engine roar, no retreat, just darkness reclaiming its hold on the desert. By the time the weekend arrived, he knew something was coming. He woke Saturday morning to find 2 uniformed deputies standing just outside his gate, not aggressive, but with that tight posture that came from being sent to knock on a door they weren't sure would stay friendly. He greeted them evenly, asked what brought them out this far. They didn't beat around the bush. "We've had a complaint," one of them said, avoiding eye contact. "A resident alleges that you've crossed into public resource land, possibly damaged an arroyo with your equipment. They claim you've refused to show identification and may be squatting." Aiden nearly laughed, not out of humor, but disbelief. He calmly handed over his document's ownership title, boundary coordinates, the signed letter from the county engineer confirming jurisdiction, everything dated, stamped, PA, and scanned. The deputies took a long moment to look it over, their expressions shifting from professional concern to faint unease. "All looks solid," one of them finally muttered. "We'll file it." Probably just a misunderstanding. But he knew it wasn't. He watched as they left, but this time one of them cast a long glance back at him, not with suspicion, but something more complicated. Pity, maybe. Or the early hint of recognition that Aiden wasn't the one escalating anything. He spent the rest of that day walking the property with a survey app, confirming line by line that nothing had changed, no new markers, no shifted posts, no altered fences. Yet when he returned to the trailer just after dusk, he found a package at the foot of his door, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. No label. Inside, a copy of the Arizona Land Use Manual, heavily annotated, with a sticky note on the inside cover that read, "Things aren't always what they seem." Some people don't want peace. They want permission. That night, Aiden didn't sleep. He didn't panic, didn't pack, didn't grab his rifle, or call the sheriff. Instead, he sat at his small desk and began writing his own statement, his own record, line by line, outlining each event as it had happened, documenting the timeline, referencing the legal framework. It wasn't for court, not yet. It was for clarity, for leverage. Because when people try to erase your presence by shifting perception, the best defense wasn't anger or resistance. It was precision. Truth layered with proof. He had learned long ago in less forgiving environments that the people who win aren't the loudest, they're the ones who are prepared. The next day, he received a cease and desist letter via courier. The sender? A local property stewardship council he'd never heard of, accusing him of altering terrain with potential regional ecological consequence. The letter was vague but dressed in legal tone, with just enough formatting to appear official if you didn't know better. He called his attorney, a no-nonsense woman out of Flagstaff who reviewed the document and dismissed it within 5 minutes. "It's not binding," she said. "They're fishing. Probably someone's personal campaign dressed up like an agency." Aiden agreed. But even as he hung up, he knew this wasn't the end of the campaign, it was just the next layer. 2 days later, his solar array was sabotaged. It wasn't destroyed, just misaligned and scratched, enough to cut his output in half and force him to run backup generators for longer than usual. Someone had approached his equipment in the night and tampered with it, not to send a message but to drain his resources, to wear him down. The same night, he heard laughter in the distance. Not drunken laughter, not youthful recklessness, something sharper, deliberate, like people sharing a joke at someone else's expense. He didn't retaliate. He didn't even report it. He simply took out his old drafting gear and began designing a reinforced perimeter, embedding his landlines into the physical world. Fencing would come later. For now, markers, real ones. Concrete, sunk deep, capped in steel. He wasn't preparing for war. He was preparing for permanence. The next morning, just after sunrise, as he was setting one of the first markers along the south ridge, a familiar voice called out from behind the ocotillo trees. "You think that'll stop anyone?" Karen stepped out slowly, dressed in walking shoes and a stiff cotton blouse, her hair pinned and her smile flat. She held a thermos in one hand, as if this were just another pleasant neighborly interaction. Aiden didn't look up. He tightened the bolts on the marker. She moved closer. "You're still here? Thought maybe you'd get the hint." He stood slowly, turned to face her, and met her gaze directly. "This isn't a conversation," he said. Karen took a sip from her thermos, then exhaled dramatically. "You don't get it. You're not part of this. You never were." Aiden said nothing. Karen tilted her head slightly. "Sooner or later, someone's going to make a decision for you. Better it be friendly." She turned and walked away. And for the first time, Aiden felt not pressure or irritation but something deeper. She wasn't bluffing, and someone was listening to her. The third week after Karen's warning was the first time Aiden felt something more primal creeping into his thoughts, not just annoyance or unease, but the subtle shift toward vigilance, the kind that rewires your sleep cycle and changes how you move through your own space. Until now, everything he'd encountered could still be filed under the category of interference, deliberate, frustrating, meant to unbalance him, but not to destroy anything outright. But the moment he found the dead animal hanging on his gate, he understood the terms had changed. It wasn't big, just a jackrabbit, stiff and sun-bleached, tied by the legs with twine to the top of his entrance post, but the message was impossible to ignore. It hadn't been there the night before. The placement was precise, the knot firm and deliberate. It wasn't some coyote's leftover kill or the mischief of a passing teenager. It was intentional and personal. He didn't touch it right away. He stood there, still holding the tool bag in his left hand, staring up at the animal with a cold kind of stillness in his chest, his thoughts not racing, but flattening into calm assessment. He made a full circuit of the perimeter after that, walking slowly, taking note of every indentation in the soil, every broken branch or shifted stone. Whoever had done this had come in quietly, either on foot or using terrain he hadn't thought to secure yet. There were no tire tracks, no fresh footprints in the wash, nothing obvious. They had planned it well. He removed the rabbit with gloves, placed it in a sealed bag, and dropped it into a cooler to preserve it. Not because he needed the remains, but because he knew better than to discard a message when he hadn't yet figured out who was speaking. Later, he would take photos of the knot, note the direction it faced, and the condition of the animal. Everything mattered now. 2 days after that, the generator stopped working. Not all at once it flickered, sputtered, then died. Aiden checked the lines. They were intact, fuel was clean. But when he opened the casing, he found the carburetor had been tampered with. The gasket was nicked and resealed with some kind of glue that would clog under heat. It wasn't the kind of thing someone could do in 30 seconds. It had taken time, tools, and familiarity with the machine. He repaired what he could, but the damage to trust lingered longer than the engine downtime. That same night, someone pounded on his trailer door at 2:43 a.m. Not a knock pounding. 3 times, then silence. By the time Aiden opened the door with his flashlight and sidearm, no one was there. No tracks. No vehicle. Just the endless wind over the ridge and the dry hush of the cactus groves behind the trailer. He didn't sleep after that. He sat at the edge of his cot, fully clothed, watching the eastern horizon until the sun crept over it and reminded him that days were still possible, even if the nights had begun to rot. He filed his second police report 2 mornings later, not because he expected help, but because he understood the importance of paper trails. He kept his voice level, provided photos, timelines, mechanical notes. The deputy, different from the last pair, seemed skeptical, though not hostile. "You sure it's not just wildlife or some drifters passing through?" he asked. Aiden didn't argue. He just handed over the bag with the rabbit, the printouts from his cameras showing interference on the feed at specific times, and a short list of names that he didn't say aloud but had written clearly in pen: Karen Baines, Carl Timmons, Jacob Voss. The deputy looked at the list and didn't ask why he'd made it. Within a week, the real attack came not physical but systemic. Aiden received a certified letter from the county land registrar informing him that a request for boundary review had been filed against his parcel, citing irregular fencing and undeclared development. It wasn't an accusation yet, but it was the kind of document that, if left unanswered, could snowball into fines, stop work orders, or worse. Aiden knew the tactic. It was the long game, a way to destabilize ownership by introducing procedural confusion. He responded immediately, attaching all his prior survey documentation, the notarized parcel history, the building permits for his off-grid utilities, and a formal rebuttal requesting that the matter be dropped unless the complainant could produce evidence of jurisdictional overreach. He copied his attorney on the response. 3 days later, a black pickup pulled up near the trailhead to his access road. It didn't enter, just sat there, engine idling, windows dark. Aiden watched from his ridgeline, binoculars steady. After 20 minutes, the truck backed up and drove off without a word. He documented the time, direction, and plate, which was partially obscured by mud but still readable. He sent it to his attorney and to the deputy who had filed his earlier report. No one followed up. The mail started coming late after that. Not delayed, altered. His water test kit arrived with the seal broken. A package of solar connectors was missing half its contents, and the box had been taped over with generic brown adhesive, not the vendor's branding. One envelope contained nothing but a ripped flyer for a gun show, with the words "Know Your Rights" scrawled across the back in sharp black marker. Another day, his trash bins stored over 50 feet from the road were found overturned, contents spread like someone had searched them for something, or wanted it to look like they had. The same week, a red X was spray painted onto the dirt path leading toward his trailer. It washed away in the rain 2 nights later, but the imprint stayed long after. He took none of this as coincidence. Coincidences were for people who didn't know what it looked like when someone wanted you gone but didn't have the guts or the power to do it directly. This was a campaign low-grade psychological warfare, curated disruption, a strategy of slow erosion designed to make him question whether staying was worth the cost. But Aiden didn't bend. He doubled his efforts instead. Reinforced the trailer's hinges and latches with internal brackets, relocated his camera feeds to off-site storage, and installed ground sensors along the lower elevation paths that no one would expect to be monitored. He kept notes, recorded audio when he walked the boundary lines, started using encrypted communication with his legal team. No social media, no digital chatter, just layers of quiet resilience. If they wanted to make him a ghost, he would become one but on his own terms. The final straw in the escalation came not with violence, but with silence. A man in a dusty Ford approached him one afternoon pretending to be lost. He asked for directions to a non-existent ranch, smiled too wide, and casually asked if Aiden was just camping here or something more permanent. His eyes were wrong, too interested, too alert. He lingered too long. Aiden gave him a vague answer and watched as he drove off without making a single note or turning on GPS. When he checked his camera later, he found that while the man had distracted him, another figure had moved through the trees on the north slope, staying just out of frame. He didn't wait for another incident. He drove into town the next day, clean clothes, composed face, and met with a retired federal land consultant his attorney had recommended. They sat in a diner, ordered burnt coffee, and reviewed his entire case documents, photos, maps, timelines. The consultant, an older man with too many scars to be academic, studied the materials and said only one thing when they were done: "You're sitting on something someone else wants. And they're not going to stop until they either get it or prove it's too expensive to try." Aiden nodded. "So what do I do?" "You stay smart. Stay documented. And you remind them, 1 inch at a time, that this land has a spine now." So Aiden went home, remarked his lines, repaired what had been tampered with. He didn't get louder. He got sharper, because they weren't trying to evict him in the legal sense. They were trying to convince him to erase himself, and he wasn't going anywhere. Aiden had never placed much value in confrontation for its own sake, but by the time the registered envelope arrived with the words "Preliminary Land Use Advisory Notification" typed in bold across the top, he understood that the line between harassment and illegal siege had been officially crossed. The letter, stamped with a local zoning office seal he hadn't seen before, informed him that his parcel had been flagged for review due to potential discrepancies related to watershed disturbance and previously undocumented historical interest in the northern quadrant of the land. The language was careful, bureaucratically vague, couched in the kind of institutional tone that suggested a decision had already been made and now simply required the proper theater to render it legitimate. At first glance, the claims made little sense. There were no water sources nearby, no historical markings on any regional record he'd studied, and the area in question was the same scrubland he'd cleared by hand months ago, but the letter also included a map, heavily redacted, with a hand-drawn circle and a note in black pen reading pending preservation status. It wasn't signed. That same afternoon, a dusty sedan pulled up just outside the entry to his land, and 2 individuals stepped out without knocking. One wore slacks and a branded utility vest. The other carried a clipboard and a camera. Aiden approached with calm restraint, asked for identification, and was given first names only, no business cards, no state credentials, just vague references to a joint environmental review team working under subcontract. They said they needed to photograph potential disturbance areas and were following up on a community-reported initiative involving land stabilization. When Aiden informed them they were trespassing and had no jurisdiction, the one with the camera stopped taking photos but said nothing. The other just nodded and left. The next day, a drone appeared, hovering low over the ridgeline for nearly 10 minutes. Aiden tracked its presence, traced its flight pattern, and followed it visually as it curved back east toward the denser residential zone that Karen Baines had long called home. He didn't react immediately. Instead, he made an appointment with a cartographic archives specialist from the university in Tucson, someone who had experienced tracing land history and ecological claims. She agreed to meet with him remotely and reviewed his documents via encrypted connection, confirming that there were no official designations or flags tied to his parcel, no preservation orders, no easements, no legacy clauses. She was professional, thorough, and genuinely surprised that someone had gone to such lengths to simulate a land dispute without triggering any actual enforcement mechanisms. Her final note: "This feels engineered not by law, but by local influence trying to mimic authority." It was the first outside confirmation Aiden had received that what he was experiencing wasn't a bureaucratic coincidence or misunderstanding, it was a campaign. Not days after their meeting, a rusted piece of metal was found embedded in the dirt path behind his trailer, half buried and sharpened at one end, like a primitive spike strip. It was clearly planted too symmetrical to be discarded debris and placed at just the right depth to catch a tire or injure someone stepping carelessly. That same night, his network went offline for 6 hours. When he checked the junction box the following morning, one of the lines had been chewed not by rodents, but cleanly cut and scorched on the edges, as if someone had tried to short it intentionally. The next town over didn't report any outages. Only his feed was down. By now, Aiden had adapted to the rhythm of pressure. He never left his property unmonitored, rotated his routines to avoid predictability, and logged every unusual incident in a layered record shared with his legal counsel and a private data archive. But the attacks had begun shifting from physical space to psychological erosion. Flyers began appearing again, tacked to fence posts, wedged into his supply delivery boxes printed with slogans like "Preserve local heritage," "Don't let outsiders erase the past." The font was faux patriotic, all stars and stripes, the kind of design that looked like it belonged to a campaign but couldn't be traced to any registered group. A local Facebook group he'd never joined began posting old photos of the land from decades past, falsely labeling them as cultural sites under threat. One post included a grainy zoomed-in image of Aiden himself, caught mid-stride near his trailer, captioned with the words, "Active surveyor reported near Sacred Drive." The comments were full of assumptions, none of them correct, all of them venomous. He didn't reply. He didn't even screenshot them. Instead, he had his lawyer prepare a formal digital evidence package for future litigation and requested a digital trace of the original poster through a cybersecurity contact he hadn't needed to call in years. What came back was unsurprising. The account was linked to a proxy server and multiple spoofed IPs, one of which originated from the municipal library Karen Baines chaired until last year. The connection was thin, but the implication was undeniable. The following week, the university's assistant archivist reached out again with news. She'd come across an old land commission memo from the 1980s during a separate project, and it included an abandoned proposal to turn several disconnected plots, including part of Aiden's land, into a state-run interpretive reserve. The plan had never gone through, but someone had clearly tried to resurrect it on paper. The kicker: the original proposal had been signed by a county planning assistant named Richard Baines, Karen's late husband. Aiden thanked her, logged the discovery, and sat in silence for a long time after ending the call. This was no longer harassment. This was legacy building by force. That weekend, he drove into town to speak with the records clerk in person. He brought every file he had, waited in line, and asked calmly to verify the status of any pending land use claims. The clerk, a man in his 50s with a quiet, measured tone, asked for the parcel number, typed for a long time, then frowned. "There's nothing officially open," he said, "but your name has come up more than once lately. A lot of people seem interested in your coordinates." Aiden asked who had submitted the inquiries. The man paused, checked the log, and said flatly, "Most of them are flagged for internal use only," which meant someone was protecting those records behind procedural opacity. which meant someone local with access. He drove home slowly, every turn of the wheel calculated, scanning the roadside like he had when he was younger and stationed in unstable terrain. This was different. Of course, no bombs, no hostile checkpoints, no soldiers in mismatched gear, but the sensation was the same. The land around him no longer existed simply as Earth. It had become language, threat, theater. Back at the property, he took out his old metal stamps and began engraving letters into steel tags, one for each major corner post of his boundary. Not just coordinates, but markers, physical proof of presence, of permanence, of refusal. Because at this point, the war being waged wasn't about rules or zoning, it was about will. It was about who would be the last one to blink. And Aiden had no intention of closing his eyes first. The breaking point didn't come as an explosion or confrontation. It came in the form of absolute stillness. For 3 consecutive days, nothing happened. No flyers, no drive-bys, no new flags planted, no damage to his equipment, no anonymous letters tucked under rocks or wedged into the gate. It was as if the pressure valve had suddenly been released. Aiden knew better than to interpret that as retreat. Real predators never attacked when you were braced. They waited until your vigilance softened, until your habits relaxed and your alertness dulled just enough to open a seam. And so when the knock came at mid-morning on a Wednesday, it didn't startle him, but it did send a thin current of something electric through his spine. It wasn't the kind of knock that asked for conversation. It was a measured, official knock, 4 sharp, spaced raps from the side door, not the front. He opened it with steady hands and found a man and a woman on the porch. The man wore plain clothes and a badge at his hip. The woman carried a leather folder and didn't introduce herself. The man said his name, identified himself as a regional compliance officer for the Department of Environmental Oversight, and said he was following up on possible misuse of territory pending secondary status as protected land. The phrasing was vague, but he spoke it like a script, clearly memorized and likely recycled. Aiden let them speak, never inviting them inside. The woman flipped open the folder and presented a series of aerial images taken from a drone, with vague highlighted outlines and arrows suggesting disruption zones. None of the markers lined up with actual coordinates, at least not his. They were fuzzy, approximated, dressed in just enough pseudo-legitimacy to confuse someone not trained to read maps critically. Aiden asked for the official complaint code. They didn't have one. He asked for a supervising office. They redirected him to a hotline that he knew from experience would cycle endlessly through options before disconnecting. He finally asked if they had a warrant or any legal right to be on the property. The man answered no. Aiden nodded once, thanked them for their time, and asked them to leave. They did, but not before the woman, halfway down the stairs, paused and said, "You could make this easier on yourself, you know. There's value in cooperation." He didn't answer. That evening, the floodlights on the western perimeter cut out. Not all at once, but in sequence. Each of the motion-triggered units snapped off the moment it was activated, as if someone had synchronized a signal to trip their internal circuits. Aiden checked the wiring, the power source, the breakers. Everything was intact. The issue wasn't physical, it was electronic, tampering on a level that required not only access to his system but deep familiarity with wireless signal override. Someone had mapped his security grid, and now they were testing the edges. Not brute force. Precision. He switched to manual lighting, reprogrammed the system, and documented the timestamps. He didn't sleep that night, not because of fear, but because the rules had once again changed. He was no longer being pushed toward frustration. He was being drawn toward error. 2 days later, he was visited again, this time by a neighborhood conservation committee representing an initiative he'd never heard of, with no official charter but plenty of custom-printed flyers and matching shirts. They weren't hostile. They smiled. They asked if he'd consider attending a regional planning roundtable to ensure harmonious land usage. One man handed him a printed agenda that included bullet points like community-led integration, land legacy visioning, and mutual soil stewardship. At the bottom, in fine print, it mentioned a potential alignment with volunteer custodianship. Aiden didn't have to read between the lines. He recognized soft annexation when he saw it. He declined their invitation, folded the paper, and set it aside. As they left, one of them turned and added, "No hard feelings, Mr. Fox. You've got something special here. Just a shame it's not better shared." That weekend, Aiden discovered his supply order had been intercepted. He'd placed a request for high-grade sealant and soil binders to reinforce the lower slope ahead of the coming rains. The vendor confirmed shipment, but the package never arrived. Instead, he received an empty box with a printed apology and no invoice. When he checked the tracking logs, it showed delivered recipient unavailable. His cameras, however, showed no delivery that day. What they did show was a different truck pulling into view, headlights off, reversing carefully down the side path before disappearing. He couldn't see the plates. He sent the footage to his lawyer, who flagged it but advised against a police report unless he could prove what had been taken. It was now bigger than Karen. That much was obvious. What had begun as one woman's crusade to preserve a fictional memory of a place that had never belonged to her had grown into a decentralized web of influence, the kind that wore the mask of community good but thrived on intimidation, misdirection, and exploitation of slow-moving bureaucracy. They didn't want the land per se. They wanted control, wanted to repurpose the land under the illusion of legality, draping their theft in the robes of preservation and stewardship. And Aiden? He was the only thing standing in the way of their narrative becoming real. When the letter from the Department of Historical Ecology arrived, he almost laughed. It was thinly disguised as a preliminary survey request, asking for temporary access to assess whether his parcel contained undocumented regional artifacts or terrain indicators of cultural importance. He checked the sender, cross-referenced the employee listed, and discovered the department had been defunded 2 years ago and folded into a different office. The letterhead was genuine, but the contact number was disconnected. It was a prop, a psychological weapon designed to look official and provoke overreaction. He didn't reply. He scanned the document, filed it, and began preparing his own official request for an internal audit of all land use inquiries connected to his coordinates over the past 12 months. His lawyer submitted it the next morning, framing it under a request for transparency and federal land ownership integrity review. That same night, someone set a fire at the edge of his southern tree line. It didn't spread. He caught it quickly, doused it, and traced the ignition point. Accelerant had been used. Not much, but enough to confirm it wasn't spontaneous combustion or lightning. He found fragments of a glass bottle nearby and tire tracks leading away from the ridge. Again, not a direct attack, just a test, a message. A reminder that escalation didn't always have to be loud to be lethal. For the first time, he notified the state fire marshal. He didn't frame it as arson, just requested a site assessment. The investigator came out, a quiet man with tired eyes and a face like weathered leather. He didn't ask many questions but walked the area twice, then looked at Aiden and said, "You're not the first." When asked what he meant, the man said nothing more. Just took photos, wrote a few notes, and left. By now, Aiden's days were measured in defensive metrics. He rewired the perimeter to include pulse detection sensors. He planted audio traps not to record voices, but to track movement patterns by displacement. He began using coded logs to track what times of day his cameras glitched, what directions his dogs stared into, and which supply companies started marking his address as restricted for delivery. But even with all that, the silence persisted. No one confronted him directly. No one trespassed in a way that could be prosecuted. Everything was suggestion, weightless pressure applied in invisible layers. And the worst part? It was effective. He started waking up with clenched teeth, started forgetting things mid-task, started finding himself staring into nothing, gripping a wrench or a length of wire, thinking not about what needed to be built but what would inevitably be destroyed. The stress wasn't in the event, it was in the waiting. And then came the drone again. But this time it hovered lower, slower, not over the ridge, but directly above the trailer, in a lazy spiral. It stayed for 6 minutes. Aiden didn't wave it off or shoot it down. He simply stepped out into the open and stared directly into the lens. He wanted them to see, wanted them to know he knew. And when it finally drifted back toward the hills, he remained standing there, arms at his sides, until the last mechanical hum faded into wind. Later that evening, he received a text message from an unknown number. It read, "You can still walk away." He didn't reply. He copied the message, logged the timestamp, then powered off the phone. Because Aiden Fox didn't walk, he fortified. The turning point didn't arrive with ceremony or confrontation, but rather through the simplest of mechanisms. A letter slid under his door in the early hours of the morning, crisp and unmarked, no envelope, no stamp. Aiden had woken not from noise, but from the shift in atmosphere that only someone living under constant pressure could sense. A disruption in the silence, a breath held too long in a room where no one should be breathing but him. He'd opened the door moments after hearing it, stepping barefoot into the pre-dawn air with a flashlight in one hand, scanning the ground in a wide arc. But there was no sign of movement, no retreating footsteps, no sound of an engine pulling away. Only the letter remained, placed with precision, as if it were an invitation and a warning all in one. Inside was a typed note, formatted like a legal brief but unsigned, its contents direct. He was being summoned to a closed administrative hearing regarding multiple unresolved community complaints. And while attendance was not legally mandatory, absence may result in unfavorable administrative conclusions and accelerated remediation procedures. The address listed wasn't a courthouse or government building, but a private office space in the basement level of a real estate agency 2 towns over, an address that didn't even show up on his standard GPS app without zooming into parcel level. There was no signature, no agency seal, and yet the language was designed to simulate pressure, legality, and consequence. He read it twice, then folded it once, placed it into a file with the others, and quietly made the decision that if the game was going to be dragged into the open, he would meet it head-on but on his own terms, not theirs. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday, 2 p.m., in a room that looked like it hadn't seen daylight since the Clinton administration. There were 5 people seated at a long folding table when he arrived, none of whom introduced themselves by title or department. Only one, a man in a blazer with a lapel pin that suggested some tie to municipal authority, offered a dry "Mr. Fox, thank you for coming." The rest simply looked at him with the kind of feigned professionalism that poorly masked anticipation. On the wall behind them was a whiteboard covered with satellite photos, parcel overlays, and what appeared to be hand-marked annotations, none of which were legally binding, but all of which were curated to suggest movement, dispute, and bureaucratic engagement. The man with the pin spoke first, outlining what he called community friction points and citing long-term regional compatibility concerns, none of which were backed by ordinance or law. It was theater structured to appear procedural, yet grounded in nothing but the repeated invocation of words like cooperation, stewardship, and long-term vision. They asked Aiden if he would consider a temporary pause on development, if he would entertain mediated dialogue, if he might be open to shared oversight in the interest of minimizing tension. It was diplomacy by erosion, a soft offer to abdicate ownership under the illusion of partnership. Aiden listened without interrupting, his hands folded in front of him, letting them fill the air with their circular logic until the man finally paused and asked, "Would you like to respond?" Aiden looked directly at him and said, "I've already responded, with my presence." He stood, nodded once, and walked out before they could object. The silence that followed him to the parking lot was louder than any argument they could have offered. That evening, his eastern fence line was torn out. Not bent or clip-torn, as if a vehicle with a winch had wrapped cable around the posts and yanked them from the earth with deliberate, methodical aggression. There were drag marks in the dirt, remnants of stakes tossed aside like bones, and fresh tire treads leading away into the brush where no road existed. This wasn't intimidation. This was retaliation. And this time it was physical. He called the sheriff's office again, filed the report, uploaded the footage, and waited. No one followed up. Not the next day, not the next week. It was the loudest silence yet. 3 days later, a drone appeared again. But this one didn't hover, it dropped. Straight down, fast and precise, landing 10 feet from his trailer before releasing a burst of high-frequency sound that cracked one of his solar lights and startled every animal within 100 yards. Then it lifted, turned, and vanished. Aiden collected the fragments, documented the time, and contacted a private investigator with experience in corporate land conflicts. Within 48 hours, the investigator returned with a report. The drone's flight path matched others registered to a third-party surveillance company under contract with a local nonprofit affiliated with Regional Ecological Integration. The name of the nonprofit? Sunbelt Horizon Alliance. The listed chairperson? Karen Baines. He didn't tell anyone what he was about to do next. Instead, he drove into the city, visited the county recorder's office, and filed an intent to countersue under malicious interference with land usage, defamation, and coordinated property sabotage. His attorney finalized the documents and requested preliminary injunctions against all named individuals, forcing a legal standstill on any future complaints, initiatives, or administrative actions targeting his land until the case could be reviewed. It wasn't a bullet, but it was a wall, and it worked. That weekend, Karen showed up in person for the first time in weeks. No car in sight, no clipboard, just her, standing at the edge of the dirt road with her arms crossed and a look in her eyes that flickered between contempt and disbelief. Aiden didn't go out to meet her. He stood on his porch, arms at his sides, and waited. She didn't speak right away. When she finally did, it wasn't a threat, it was a statement, one that dripped with finality. You think you've won something. But people like you don't belong here. Aiden replied only once. People like me, he said slowly, are the ones who build what you try to steal. She stared for a moment longer, then turned and walked back down the road, disappearing into the distance like the shadow of something too weak to survive in daylight. That night, no drones came. No lights were cut. No signs appeared. Just silence. But it was a different kind of silence now, not the coiled threat of a snake waiting to strike, but the silence of something cornered, recalibrating. He didn't trust it, not entirely, but he allowed himself to exhale for the first time in what felt like months. He hadn't won. Not yet, but he'd taken the ground back beneath his own feet, and he wasn't giving it up again. Clean victory was never something Aiden believed in, at least not in the clean, cinematic sense that people love to imagine a final standoff, a thunderous reckoning, a line drawn and respected once the smoke cleared. The reality of resolution was far quieter, far stranger, and far more bureaucratic than most had the patience to endure. It didn't come with a loud verdict or televised statement. It came in the form of a series of official letters, one after another, stacked neatly in his mailbox over the course of 3 weeks, each from a different county or state office. Each acknowledging the conclusion of a previously initiated action, investigation, or internal review, now declared void, inconclusive, or officially closed due to lack of legal grounds. The preservation claim was dismissed. The environmental audit flagged as unauthorized. The boundary complaint retracted without explanation. The nonprofit ceased activity after a forensic audit tied it to misappropriation of regional development funds. Karen Baines' name never appeared directly in any formal reprimand, but her position on the local civic board was vacated quietly, her initiative websites taken down, and her front gate, once plastered with laminated messages about tradition and guardianship, now stood bare behind a chain-link fence faded by sun and time. Aiden didn't see her again after that last encounter. He didn't need to. The machine she'd built had run out of parts. What remained in the wake of it all was not just a patch of land with reinforced boundaries and legal protections, it was a place reclaimed by proof, 1 inch at a time, he'd count not through violence or vengeance, but through documentation, presence, and relentless unwillingness to be moved. He didn't expand the property, didn't build a monument or raise a flag. He kept things simple, quiet. He reinforced the road with gravel, replaced the temporary fencing with custom-fitted steel posts, reset his perimeter sensors, and finalized the irrigation channels he'd been working on before the conflict began. He paid the last of his legal fees, printed hard copies of every document connected to the campaign against him, sealed them in a waterproof case, cut and buried it beneath the largest mesquite on the north side of the trailer, not out of paranoia, but as an offering to the future, a record in case it ever started again, not for him but for whoever came next. Because land, he knew now more than ever, was never truly owned. It was borrowed from time and contested by story, and the stories others tried to impose on his had finally failed. The local sheriff, to his quiet credit, stopped by once near the end, not in uniform, not with a file, but in person, driving an old civilian truck and holding 2 coffees from a diner down the highway. He didn't stay long. They stood outside near the southern fence line, where the new boundary markers gleamed faintly in the sun, and spoke in low tones. The sheriff said only that things had gotten out of hand and that it won't happen again. Aiden didn't ask for an apology, and none was offered. They shook hands. That was enough. In the weeks that followed, the quiet returned, but not the uneasy kind, not the silence soaked with the tension of surveillance or the breathlessness of waiting for another shoe to drop. This was the real kind, the sound of the desert being what it was long before people tried to shape it into something unnatural. The air carried less static. The dogs no longer bristled at invisible movements beyond the trees. Deliveries arrived on time. No new markers appeared. And most importantly, no one knocked on his door. He spent his mornings walking the property without checking over his shoulder, his afternoons repairing erosion barriers, and his evenings reading by the open trailer door, the wind rolling in cool from the east. He planted a line of creosote along the western slope, not for beauty, but because it would root deep and slow the soil from washing away. And when it bloomed, it reminded him of something solid, grounded, and old enough to matter. One morning, near the start of summer, he drove into town for supplies and caught a glance of his own reflection in the shop window, sunburned, lean, lined by weeks of hard work and harder decisions. For the first time in a long time, he looked like someone who belonged not because he was accepted, but because he had endured. The cashier, a young man who hadn't met his eyes the first few months after he moved in, nodded as he handed over the receipt. "Heard things finally settled," he said. Aiden simply nodded back. They did. He drove home slow that day, letting the dust rise behind his tires, watching the horizon without thinking about who might be watching him from it. There were no watchers now. No games left to play. He had survived the long erasure not by becoming louder, but by refusing to disappear. And the land, in return, had stayed with him. At the edge of his property, beneath a wide patch of shade, he installed a single sign. Not made of plastic or mass-printed laminate, but of heavy wood, carved by hand with steady precision. It bore no threats, no slogans, no flags, just 6 words. Private land. Owned. Occupied. Stay back. It was the only voice he needed now. The rest had already been said, risen, heard,